The 1950s weren't all innocence and Mickey Mouse. Beneath the smiling faces of Saturday morning cartoons, a darker, more rebellious side of animation was taking shape, one that pushed political, religious, and cultural boundaries. These 15-band animated films weren't just controversial, they were dangerous. Stay with us as we reveal the shocking cartoons that censors never wanted you to see. Animal Farm, 1954. George Orwell's dystopian classic was always bound to ruffle feathers, but when it was adapted into animation in 1954, it became a Cold War weapon and a banned piece of media across much of the world. Produced in Britain by Haylos and Batchelor, Animal Farm was the first British animated feature released in theaters. However, behind the scenes, the CIA secretly funded the project, rewriting Orwell's ending to be even more aggressively anti-communist. In Orwell's original version, the pigs become indistinguishable from the tyrants they overthrew. But in the film, the animals rise again to overthrow the pigs, an ending meant to stir rebellion behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union, East Germany, China, and several other communist nations quickly labeled the film as dangerous propaganda. It was officially banned for its clear allegorical attack on Stalinist rule. Even in the West, the film's darker themes, betrayal, executions, authoritarianism, made it a subject of heated debate. Schools refused to screen it, and some parents deemed it unsuitable for children, despite its animated format. It wasn't just the political message that raised eyebrows. The haunting art style, muted colors, and cold clinical narration made Animal Farm feel more like psychological warfare than a cartoon. The fact that it was secretly backed by American intelligence only added to its controversy, making it a rare case where animation was directly weaponized as part of global conflict. Today, Animal Farm stands as a landmark in political animation, a cautionary tale not just about power, but about how art itself can become a battlefield. Its ban in the Eastern Bloc wasn't just censorship, it was recognition of how powerful a harmless cartoon could actually be. The Telltale Heart, 1953. With its surreal visuals and chilling narration, The Telltale Heart became one of the first animated films in America to be rated X by the British Board of Film Censors, but for sheer psychological horror. Adapted from Edgar Allan Poe's iconic short story, this nightmarish animated short pushed the boundaries of what animation could be and where it could go. Directed by Ted Parmalee and narrated by the unmistakable voice of James Mason, the film dives into the unraveling mind of a murderer, haunted by the sound of a beating heart beneath the floorboards. But this wasn't just a gothic retelling for literary buffs. It was a full-on descent into madness, rendered in bold, expressionist visuals that felt closer to a bad trip than a bedtime story. The reaction was swift and divided. Some critics hailed it as a masterpiece of adult animation, while others were horrified by its graphic themes and morbid tone. Schools and public broadcasters refused to air it. It was banned in multiple local TV markets in the United States, pulled from community centers, and barred from some international film festivals on grounds of being unsuitable for all audiences. Particularly in conservative circles, The Telltale Heart became a scapegoat in the debate over media violence and mental illness. Why was something so dark being animated at all? Didn't cartoons belong to children? That question, of course, was the point. The Telltale Heart was never meant for kids. It was an early, bold example of how animation could tackle mature psychological horror in a way that live action never could. But in the buttoned-up 1950s, such boldness was punished. It wouldn't find true appreciation until decades later, when adult animation finally got its due. Hanzel and Gretle, an opera fantasy, 1954. When audiences first saw Hanzel and Gretel, an opera fantasy, they were mesmerized by its stop-motion puppetry and lush visuals. But as the sugar-coated surface gave way to dark, operatic terror, some parents and religious leaders began sounding the alarm. Based on Engelbert Humperdinck's 1893 opera, this American adaptation by RKO and producer Michael Meyerberg was the first stop-motion animated feature made in the United States, and the first to face moral backlash for its intense themes. While Disney had long sanitized fairy tales, this film embraced the grim heart of the original story. Children abandoned in the woods, a grotesque witch fattening them up for slaughter, eerie shadows, unsettling musical crescendos, and scenes of near death. It was all there, set to classical German opera. The Catholic Legion of Decency gave the film a warning rating, cautioning parents that it wasn't appropriate for young children. Several religious institutions refused to screen it, claiming the portrayal of witches, child endangerment, and demonic imagery was morally corrosive. Some schools canceled showings after protests from PTA groups, who argued that the dark opera soundtrack paired with disturbing visuals could traumatize young viewers. Even animation fans were divided. Was it art, or was it simply too creepy for its own good? Over time, the film gained cult status among stop-motion enthusiasts. But in the 1950s, its gothic style and embrace of fairy tale horror proved too much for family audiences. Hanzel and Gretle. An opera fantasy may have been groundbreaking, but it also revealed that audiences weren't yet ready for animation that walked into the shadows, especially when those shadows were filled with witches and ovens. A is for Adam, 1953. Produced by General Electric and designed to educate the public on the miracle of nuclear energy, A is for Adam was a slick, futuristic cartoon that carried a terrifying undertone. Though it was marketed as an educational short, it quickly became one of the most controversial animated films of the Cold War. The film introduces audiences to an anthropomorphized Adam, who cheerfully explains how nuclear power is safe, clean, and the future of humanity. But beneath the smiling cartoons and jazz-infused score lay an unmistakable pro-nuclear agenda. Created during the Eisenhower administration's Atoms for Peace campaign, the film was funded by private corporations with vested interests in the atomic industry. The goal? To normalize nuclear power and minimize public fear. That propaganda element is exactly why it was banned across the Eastern Bloc. Countries like the Soviet Union, East Germany, and China saw A is for Adam as blatant capitalist indoctrination. But even in the United States, the film faced criticism. Scientists and anti-nuclear activists accused it of downplaying radiation risks and glamorizing a still controversial technology. In schools, it became a hot-button issue. Some educators refused to screen it, claiming it was more PR than science. Religious groups also raised concerns, calling the cartoon's worship of science borderline idolatry. Its cheerful tone clashed horribly with recent memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, making it feel more like denial than education. Today, A is for Adam is studied in film and political science courses as a prime example of Cold War propaganda disguised as educational animation. But in the 1950s, its cheery Atom mascot and glowing promises made it one of the most controversial cartoons of the atomic age. Rudy Toot, 1951. Long before MTV or Adult Swim, there was Rudy Toot, a jazzy stylized short that dared to mix murder, infidelity, and courtroom satire in a neon-drenched fever dream. Directed by John Hubley and produced by UPA, this film was revolutionary in its design and storytelling, and immediately deemed too inappropriate for traditional animation audiences. Based on the folk ballad Frankie and Johnny, the story centers on a woman who shoots her lover in a fit of rage and then stands trial. But this isn't a straightforward tale of crime and punishment. The characters are abstract, exaggerated, and infused with an urban coolness that felt more Greenwich Village than Hollywood. The jazzy score underscored a whirlwind of scandal, cheating lovers, corrupt lawyers, and courtroom chaos. Censors didn't know what to make of it. While the film was critically acclaimed and even nominated for an Oscar, many schools and family-friendly venues refused to show it. It was considered too adult, too violent, and far too suggestive in its tone. Some conservative towns flat out banned it from being screened at local festivals or community events. Even its art style was a lightning rod. The angular characters and minimalist backgrounds rejected Disney's realism, unsettling audiences used to soft lines and happy endings. This was animation with edge, and that edge cut deep. Rudy Toot wasn't just a cartoon. It was a challenge to everything animation was supposed to be in the 1950s, and for many, that made it dangerous. Gerald McBoing, 1950. At first glance, Gerald McBoing seems like a whimsical children's tale. A boy who speaks in sound effects instead of words. It's quirky, fun, and vibrantly animated. But beneath that playful surface lies a deeper message about nonconformity, social rejection, and the cost of individualism. Ideas that got the film banned in apartheid-era South Africa and frowned upon in other authoritarian regions. Based on a story by Dr. Seuss and produced by UPA, Gerald McBoing broke the mold of traditional animation. It didn't rely on dialogue or classical character design. Instead, it used bold, abstract visuals and jazz rhythms to tell the story of a child who is ridiculed by adults for being different. Gerald can't speak like others. He only makes sound effects, and he's bullied, expelled, and misunderstood until he finds a place where his unique voice is celebrated. In the 1950s America, this message of inclusion and celebrating difference was groundbreaking. But in countries with rigid ideas about race, conformity, and tradition, it was dangerous. South African authorities banned the film, labeling it subversive. They feared it would promote liberal ideas and challenge the strict cultural norms that upheld apartheid. Even in the United States, some conservative school districts and religious groups considered the film problematic. They accused it of promoting rebellion against authority and undermining the importance of discipline and uniformity in children. What they missed was that Gerald McBoing wasn't trying to incite rebellion. It was championing empathy. It showed that difference isn't something to fear, but something to value. That message made it beloved by progressives and blacklisted by others. For a film that doesn't use a single spoken word, Gerald McBoing spoke volumes about the fight for individuality in a conformist era. Private Snafu series, early 1950s showings. Though most of the Private Snafu series was created during World War II, many of its episodes were still shown on U.S. military bases in the early 1950s, until controversy forced them underground. These animated shorts were produced by Warner Brothers and supervised by Frank Capra, with writing from none other than Dr. Seuss and voices by Mel Blanc. But these weren't Saturday morning cartoons. They were raw, risque, and meant for adult soldiers only. The purpose was clear: educate American troops on what not to do. But the way the message was delivered raised eyebrows. Snafu, an acronym for Situation Normal, all fucked up, was a bumbling, obsessed, rule-breaking soldier who constantly got into trouble. The episodes featured everything from spies disguised as sensual women to warnings about STDs, loose lips, and military discipline. And they did it, all with slapstick humor, innuendo, and wild animation. In the 1950s, as these cartoons began resurfacing for general audiences through bootlegs and reel swaps, the backlash was immediate. Parents were shocked. School boards banned the shorts outright. Religious leaders called them vulgar. And even the military distanced itself, especially as the Cold War demanded a more buttoned-up public image. Internationally, countries like the United Kingdom, Canada, and conservative areas in Latin America banned the shorts entirely, calling them disrespectful to the armed forces and morally corrupting. Despite being brilliantly animated and historically significant, Private Snafu was simply too explicit for the delicate sensibilities of the 1950s. It wasn't until decades later that historians and animation buffs began to re-examine the series as a bold experiment in adult education through animation. Dusty of the Circus, 1954. Dusty of the Circus, a lesser-known French animated feature, caused a quiet uproar when it was released in 1954. Directed by Jean Image, the film follows a young boy who runs away to join the circus and ends up in a fantastical world filled with eccentric performers, misunderstood clowns, and surreal dream sequences. What made it controversial wasn't just its avant-garde style, but its bold approach to gender, identity, and the absurd. The film's main character, Dusty, is a gender-fluid figure whose delicate features and soft voice confused audiences and critics alike. While never explicitly stated, Dusty's androgynous design and emotional journey sparked outrage in conservative countries, particularly in Catholic-dominated parts of Europe. The Vatican-aligned Catholic film boards in Italy and Spain outright banned the film, accusing it of glamorizing gender confusion. Compounding the issue were scenes that suggested themes of childhood trauma, neglect, and even subtle references to abuse, heavily implied through metaphor and dream logic. Dusty finds solace among circus performers, many of whom are portrayed as societal rejects. One clown character, dressed in traditionally feminine attire, sings a melancholic song about losing their identity. For 1950s audiences, this was coded language for taboo topics. In the United States, the film was only sparsely distributed and heavily edited before limited screenings. Critics praised its artistry, but were baffled by its narrative structure and its refusal to cater to children's entertainment norms. Some newspapers even suggested that the film was for adults only, though it contained no explicit material. What Dusty of the Circus exposed was that animation could serve as a vehicle for exploring the psychological and emotional struggles of the marginalized. That made it a threat, and like many ahead of its time works, it was buried for decades before being quietly rediscovered by underground film circles. Destination Earth, 1956. At first glance, Destination Earth looks like a charming science fiction cartoon aimed at kids, but a closer look reveals it's a full-blown propaganda piece crafted by the American petroleum industry, and that's exactly why it was banned across much of the communist world. Produced by John Sutherland Productions and backed by the American Petroleum Institute, the film tells the story of Martians who journey to Earth to learn about free enterprise and the wonders of oil-based energy. The Martians, ruled by a totalitarian government on their own planet, are stunned by what they see in 1950s America. Gas stations, oil refineries, happy consumers, and, of course, the benefits of capitalism. They return to Mars and start a revolution, all thanks to oil. To viewers in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries, this cartoon was an ideological attack disguised as education. Communist governments quickly banned it, labeling it capitalist poison for the minds of youth. Chinese authorities followed suit, warning that the film promoted Western imperialism under the guise of technological optimism. In the United States, critics from left-leaning groups raised their eyebrows too. The film glossed over the environmental impact of oil, portrayed big business as the savior of civilization, and turned real-world industrial lobbying into a Martian fairy tale. It was shown in schools and public libraries, sparking debates about whether it was truly educational or just corporate propaganda aimed at kids. Despite the controversy, Destination Earth remains a fascinating artifact of Cold War messaging. Its ban abroad and growing discomfort at home proved that even a silly cartoon about Martians and gas pumps could become a political weapon in the hands of those with something to sell. The Magic Brush, 1955. In 1955, Chinese animators unveiled The Magic Brush, a beautifully illustrated short film about a poor boy who discovers a magical paintbrush that brings anything he paints to life. While the tale was based on a well-loved Chinese folktale, the film took a sharp ideological turn, and that's what got it banned in Taiwan and several British colonies. At the heart of the story is Ma Liang, a peasant boy who uses his magical brush not for wealth or vanity, but to help fellow villagers. When greedy landlords and corrupt officials try to exploit his power, Ma Liang outwits them using his artistic gifts, ultimately overthrowing the unjust system. On the surface, it's a charming fable about creativity and kindness, but politically, it struck a much deeper nerve. Created by the Shanghai Animation Film Studio, The Magic Brush was one of the earliest Chinese animations made after the Communist Revolution. As such, it carried the values of the new regime, glorifying the peasant class, villainizing greed and authority, and celebrating the power of the collective. It wasn't just a story, it was a lesson in revolutionary values. British-controlled Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore saw the message for what it was: communist propaganda disguised as folklore. The film was immediately pulled from theaters and banned outright. In Western circles, educators and analysts praised the animation quality but warned of its political content. Schools in America were discouraged from screening it, despite its artistic merit. Despite the bans, the film became beloved within China and remains a cultural touchstone today. But its suppression abroad is a reminder that in the Cold War era, even the gentlest fairy tale could be seen as a dangerous weapon, especially when it came wielding a paintbrush. Allegro Nontropo, 1950s segments. Though the full-feature Allegro Nontropo wasn't released until 1976, its earliest animated segments were developed in the 1950s by Italian animator Bruno Bozzito. These bold, experimental pieces, set to classical music in the tradition of Fantasia, were quietly shown at private screenings across Europe, often causing controversy and leading to bans in conservative regions. What made Bozzito's early work so controversial was its unapologetic irreverence. These segments tackled subjects like human evolution, frustration, war, religion, and existential dread, all told through surreal, often bleak animation. In one segment, Adam and Eve are reimagined as grotesque caricatures of modern man and woman, gorging themselves and succumbing to technology. Another showed a soldier morphing into a monkey, hinting at mankind's regression rather than progress. While Disney's Fantasia had faced some backlash for its dark imagery, Bozzito took the concept even further. Religious leaders across Italy, Spain, and Portugal demanded that screenings be canceled, calling the material blasphemous. In one famous incident in 1958, a university in Rome was forced to shut down a private showing after protesters accused it of mocking Christianity. Because the segments had no formal distributor, they existed in a legal gray area, shared via reels between film clubs and bohemian cafes. Censors couldn't always trace them, but when they could, they cracked down hard. Copies were confiscated. Animators and organizers were fined. And Bozzito was labeled dangerously provocative by Italy's Ministry of Culture. These early animations were controversial because they challenged the core belief that animation was for children. Bozzito wasn't making cartoons to amuse. He was making visual symphonies to question society. That defiance got him banned in multiple countries long before the public would even know his name. Fables of the Green Forest, 1950s Japan. Fables of the Green Forest may sound innocent, but behind its charming woodland creatures was a powerful message of national identity that led to its banning in occupied Japan and severe censorship in Allied-controlled territories. The animated series was adapted from traditional Japanese folk tales, many of which featured themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and nature's harmony, core tenets of pre-war Shinto and nationalist ideologies. During the 1950s, Japan was still under strong influence from the United States and Allied forces, who were wary of any media that might rekindle nationalist sentiments. The adorable animal characters and Fables of the Green Forest weren't the issue. It was what they represented. The stories celebrated traditional Japanese values, sometimes even referencing historical battles or emperor mythology through allegory. One specific episode, featuring a fox who gives his life for his village, was criticized by American censors for glorifying self-sacrifice in a way that mirrored the kamikaze ethos of World War II. Another episode hinted at reverence for a mystical mountain spirit, which officials interpreted as veiled emperor worship. The result? The show was banned in several Japanese school systems overseen by Allied forces, and distribution was halted until edits could be made. In the United States, where some dubbed episodes were considered for import, the show was quietly dropped by broadcasters after cultural advisors flagged its nationalistic undertones. Ironically, the creators never intended to make a political statement. Their aim was to preserve fading cultural stories through animation, but in the hypersensitive post-war world, even folktales could be seen as a threat. Over time, Fables of the Green Forest became a symbol of the struggle between traditional heritage and imposed modernity, a quiet casualty of cultural censorship wrapped in soft colors and gentle creatures. The Little Island, 1958. British animator Richard Williams, who would later go on to animate Who Framed Roger Rabbit, first burst onto the scene with The Little Island in 1958. It was a wordless animated short film exploring three philosophical forces, truth, beauty, and good, and their descent into misunderstanding, pride, and eventual destruction. Abstract, symbolic, and deeply unsettling, it was hailed as genius by critics and immediately banned in multiple countries. In Arab nations such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the film was deemed blasphemous. One of the characters, a floating figure representing truth, was interpreted as a stand-in for God or divine knowledge. His animated metamorphoses and confrontations with good and beauty were labeled sacrilegious by religious authorities. The film's ending, which depicts the destruction of the island due to ideological conflict, was seen as nihilistic and inappropriate for public consumption. In conservative regions of the United States, the film wasn't officially banned, but was excluded from festivals and college programs for being too abstract and philosophically inappropriate. Some saw its minimalistic design and fluid movement as disturbing rather than artistic. Compounding the backlash was the presence of implied nudity in the humanoid figures. Their lack of clothes, exaggerated bodily transformations, and symbolic violence led to accusations of indecency, especially in regions where any hint of the human form was taboo. Despite all this, The Little Island won the BAFTA Award for Best Animated Film, and later became a cult classic among animation students and philosophers. But in 1958, its refusal to offer easy answers, and its haunting message that even noble ideals can destroy one another, made it too dangerous for the post-war moral order. The Romance of Transportation in Canada, 1952. This National Film Board of Canada production seems like a dry educational short on the surface, but The Romance of Transportation in Canada became surprisingly controversial thanks to its biting satire, caricatured visuals, and uncomfortable treatment of Indigenous peoples. Directed by Colin Lowe and animated in a minimalist, modernist style, the film traces the evolution of Canadian transportation from dog sleds to highways. But what made the film unsettling for some viewers was its tone. Rather than celebrating progress with blind patriotism, the film took a wry, sarcastic approach, mocking colonial arrogance, questioning technological worship, and subtly critiquing Canada's treatment of its native population. The section that drew the most backlash was the portrayal of early settlers and Indigenous people. While framed as humor, the exaggerated accents, reductive stereotypes, and dismissive commentary angered both Indigenous communities and educators. Native advocacy groups protested its screening in schools, while conservative broadcasters demanded edits or removal from programming schedules. In the United States, the film was pulled from several public libraries due to complaints about disrespectful humor and historical inaccuracies. Meanwhile, Canadian officials wrestled with the contradiction: should a government-funded cartoon be allowed to satirize government actions? The result was a temporary withdrawal from classroom circulation in parts of Canada and a total blackout in some American school systems. Today, it's viewed as a bold precursor to Canada's later tradition of self-critical animation. But in the polite society of the 1950s, it was deemed rude, inappropriate, and unfit for impressionable audiences. Piel de Asno, 1950s Spain. During Francoist Spain, even fairy tales weren't safe from the censors, and Piel de Asno proved it. Based on Charles Perrault's classic tale, Donkey Skin, this 1950s animated adaptation by a small Spanish studio was immediately suppressed after its limited screenings. On the surface, the film appeared to follow the whimsical outline of a magical story: a princess, a disguise, a prince, and a happily ever after. But what lay underneath was far more disturbing and far too daring for a dictatorship obsessed with moral purity. The story revolves around a king who promises to only remarry a woman as beautiful as his late queen. Tragically, that woman turns out to be his own. The princess, determined to escape an unwanted marriage proposed by her own father, disguises herself in a donkey skin and flees to begin a new life. Though Charles Perrault's original tale had existed for centuries, the story's themes of personal freedom and questioning traditional power structures were seen as too controversial under Franco's rule in Spain. Religious authorities called the film inappropriate, claiming it was morally unsuitable and not fit for general audiences. Even though the filmmakers softened the story's more intense elements and avoided anything explicit, the central idea, a father proposing to his daughter, led to the film being banned outright. The Spanish Film Board refused to distribute it, and it's believed that most copies were destroyed. Cultural officials also objected to how the film portrayed royalty as flawed and human, an indirect challenge to Spain's idealized image of leadership and family values under Franco. For years, Piel de Asno was spoken of in hushed tones among Spanish animators, becoming a lost legend, an artistic gem never given the chance to shine. Today, only scattered references and brief clips remain, with the film's legacy hidden, like the princess beneath her disguise. Its banning shows how even fairy tales can be seen as a threat when they encourage people to think differently. These films prove that animation isn't just for kids. It's a powerful medium that can challenge deep cultural taboos. Silenced and forgotten, they dared to speak in ways others wouldn't. Which one surprised you the most? Let us know. And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden history.